Okay, so let's dive into some pretty intense stuff today.
Yeah.
You shared some sources with me that really make you think. A YouTube discussion with Aaron Abke
Hmm.
and a compilation of some biblical passages. And they all raise this kind of unsettling question. What if Christian societies actually modeled themselves after the God of the Old Testament?
Yeah, it's a thought-provoking question for sure, and one with potentially huge implications. I mean, we're talking about a God who often seems to endorse violence, punishment, even genocide. It's hard to reconcile that image with the loving, forgiving God that many Christians believe in.
Yeah, it's like two completely different personalities we see in the Bible. On one hand, you've got the God of the Old Testament wiping out entire nations, like the Canaanites, Amalekites,
Yeah.
Midianites. There's the flood, Sodom and Gomorrah. It's pretty intense stuff.
Yeah, and what's particularly striking is the specific language used. In Deuteronomy, for example, God explicitly commands the Israelites to completely destroy them, leaving no survivors. This wasn't just about conquering land, it was about eradicating entire populations.
Wow. It makes you wonder how that kind of thinking would play out in a modern-day society. Can you imagine a world leader today calling for the annihilation of a group of people based on their beliefs? It's unthinkable.
Yeah, it would be considered a horrific crime against humanity. And yet, this is the God presented in the Old Testament, a God who seems to operate on a very different moral framework than what we consider acceptable today.
And that's where the contrast with Jesus becomes so stark. He's constantly preaching love, forgiveness, turning the other cheek. He even tells his disciples to love their enemies.
Right. It's a radical departure from the Old Testament mindset. Instead of focusing on retribution and punishment, Jesus emphasizes compassion, understanding, and seeking the good in everyone. It raises the question, are we talking about the same God here?
Exactly. And that's something Abkik really hammered on in that YouTube video. He calls the God of the Old Testament a twisted God, saying it's impossible to reconcile those depictions with the Jesus we see in the Gospels.
Yeah, he makes a strong point. If we take Jesus at his word, if we believe he is the ultimate revelation of God's nature, then it forces us to rethink our understanding of the Old Testament.
Abkik even suggests that the early church, especially Paul, cherry-picked what they wanted from Jesus' teachings to fit their own agenda. He claims the concept of sin nature isn't found in Jesus' words. But was a Pauline invention to control people?
That's a controversial claim for sure, but it's true that Paul's writings played a significant role in shaping Christian theology. And some scholars do believe that Paul's emphasis on original sin and the need for atonement through Christ's sacrifice may have shifted the focus away from Jesus' more radical message of love and personal transformation.
And then there's the whole issue of the Ebionites, this early Christian sect led by James, Jesus' brother. Abkik says they rejected Paul as a heretic and followed a much stricter interpretation of Jesus' teachings.
Yeah, the Ebionites are fascinating because they represent a very different strain of early Christianity, one that was ultimately marginalized. They believed that Jesus was a human prophet, not a divine being, and they rejected the idea of Paul's teachings being on par with Jesus's.
So we've got these two very different pictures of God emerging, the wrathful God of the Old Testament and the loving God revealed through Jesus. And then you have these competing interpretations within early Christianity itself. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It certainly challenges us to think critically about the origins of our beliefs. Where do these ideas come from? Who gets to decide which interpretations are valid? And how do these different understandings of God shape our actions in the world?
Speaking of actions, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the impact of these competing interpretations on Christian societies. Specifically, what happened when European Christians encountered indigenous cultures during the Age of Exploration.
That's where things get really interesting. If Christian societies had truly modeled themselves after the teachings of Jesus, love, compassion, respect for others, the history of colonialism might have unfolded very differently.
Yeah, imagine those explorers landing on foreign shores and approaching the indigenous people with humility and a genuine desire to understand their cultures.
Instead of seeing them as savages in need of conversion, they might have recognized their wisdom, their deep connection to the land, their rich spiritual traditions. It could have been a remarkable exchange of knowledge and perspectives.
Instead, we saw widespread violence,
Yeah.
forced conversions, and the destruction of entire civilizations. And you have to wonder if the Old Testament's depiction of a conquering God played a role in justifying those atrocities.
Yeah, it's a disturbing thought, but one that's worth exploring. Did the belief in a God who commanded the extermination of entire groups make it easier for European Christians to dehumanize indigenous people and justify their own acts of brutality?
If those early Christians had truly embraced the teachings of Jesus, Would they have felt compelled to conquer and convert in the first place? Or would they have approached those encounters with a spirit of humility and respect, seeking to learn and collaborate rather than dominate?
It's a question that can make us completely reimagine the course of history. What if, instead of conquest and forced assimilation, we'd seen genuine dialogue, cultural exchange, and mutual understanding?
Yeah, we could have had a world where different cultures coexisted peacefully, learning from each other's traditions and working together to solve common challenges.
Imagine the richness and diversity that would have flourished. Instead of trying to impose a single worldview, Christian societies could have embraced the tapestry of human experience, recognizing the inherent dignity and value of every culture.
It's a tantalizing glimpse into a world that could have been. But it also raises a crucial question for us today. How do we move beyond the legacy of violence and oppression that's been justified in the name of religion?
That's where the real work begins. We need to critically examine our beliefs, challenge harmful interpretations, and actively work to create a world that reflects the love and compassion that Jesus embodied.
So we've seen how the Old Testament's depiction of God could have had devastating consequences for indigenous cultures. But there's another important question to consider. Is this wrathful, vengeful God truly the same God that Jesus called Father?
Yeah, it's a question that has haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries. How do we reconcile the God of love and mercy revealed in Jesus with the God of wrath and vengeance depicted in the Old Testament?
It's a real head scratcher. On one hand, you have Jesus saying things like, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And then you flip back to the Old Testament and see God commanding the Israelites to wipe out entire cities, including women and children.
Yeah, the sheer violence of some of those Old Testament passages can be shocking to modern readers. You know, we've grown accustomed to seeing God through the lens of Jesus, so those depictions of divine retribution can feel jarring and even morally reprehensible.
Abke even goes so far as to say that the Old Testament God is a monster, a being completely at odds with the loving, compassionate God that Jesus revealed. He believes that focusing on the Old Testament can actually distort our understanding of God and lead to harmful beliefs.
Yeah, it's certainly true that selective readings of the Old Testament have been used to justify all sorts of atrocities throughout history, from the Crusades to the persecution of heretics and the enslavement of Africans.
Right, it's like people pick and choose the verses that support their pre-existing biases, ignoring the larger context of the scriptures.
And that's why it's so important to engage with these texts critically, to consider the historical and cultural context in which they were written, and to always interpret them through the lens of love and compassion that Jesus embodied.
So how do we make sense of these seemingly contradictory depictions of God? Is there a way to reconcile the God of the Old Testament with the God revealed through Jesus?
Well, some theologians believe in the concept of progressive revelation, the idea that God reveals himself to humanity in stages, over time. They argue that the Old Testament reflects an earlier, less complete understanding of God, one that was later refined and perfected through the life and teachings of Jesus.
So it was like humanity's understanding of God was evolving, just as our understanding of the world around us was evolving.
Exactly. And as our moral and spiritual consciousness developed, so too did our conception of the divine, the God of the Old Testament, with his emphasis on justice and retribution, might represent an earlier stage in that evolution, while the God of love and mercy revealed in Jesus represents a more mature and compassionate understanding.
But even if we accept that God's revelation is progressive, it still leaves us with a difficult question. How do we reconcile the violence and cruelty depicted in the Old Testament with our belief in a loving and merciful God?
That's where things get really challenging. There's no easy answer. And theologians have wrestled with this question for centuries. Some argue that the violence in the Old Testament is simply a reflection of the brutal times in which it was written. Others suggest that those passages should be interpreted metaphorically, as symbolic representations of spiritual truths.
But isn't there a danger in trying to explain away or downplay the violence in the Old Testament? Doesn't that risk minimizing the very real suffering that was inflicted in God's name?
You're right, it's a delicate balance. We can't simply ignore or dismiss those difficult passages, but we also can't allow them to define our understanding of God, or to justify violence and oppression in the world today.
So how do we navigate this tension? How do we hold both the love and the wrath, the mercy and the judgment, in our understanding of God?
Perhaps it's not about trying to reconcile those seemingly contradictory aspects of God, but about recognizing that the divine is ultimately beyond our human comprehension, We try to fit God into neat little boxes, to define him with our limited language and concepts. But the reality is that God is vast and mysterious, and our understanding of him will always be incomplete.
That makes sense. It's like trying to describe the ocean by looking at a single drop of water.
Exactly. We can glimpse aspects of God's nature through the scriptures, through our own experiences, through the lives of those who have walked closely with the divine. But the fullness of God will always remain a mystery, something that transcends our human understanding.
So where does this leave us in terms of the implications for Christian societies? If the God of the Old Testament isn't the ultimate model for how we should live and govern ourselves, then what is?
That's the crucial question. And I think the answer lies in embracing the radical message of love and compassion that Jesus embodied. If we want to create a world that reflects the true nature of God, then we need to prioritize those values above all else.
But isn't that easier said than done? I mean, the world can be a pretty harsh place, and sometimes it feels like you have to fight fire with fire.
Of course, there will always be challenges, and there will be times when we need to stand up for justice and protect the vulnerable. But even in those situations, we can act with love and compassion, seeking to understand our enemies and to find solutions that promote peace and reconciliation.
So are you saying that we should just ignore the Old Testament altogether, pretend that those passages about violence and judgment don't exist?
Not at all. The Old Testament is a rich and complex text that contains profound wisdom and insights. But we need to read it with discernment, recognizing that it reflects a particular historical and cultural context. We can't simply lift verses out of context and use them to justify our own agendas.
It sounds like we need to approach the scriptures with a spirit of humility, recognizing that our interpretations are always going to be limited and imperfect.
Absolutely. We need to be willing to listen to different perspectives, to challenge our own assumptions, and to always strive for a deeper understanding of God's will.
This deep dive has really made me think about the power of interpretation. It's not just about what the scriptures say, but about how we choose to read and understand them.
That's right. We all bring our own biases and preconceptions to the table, and those inevitably shape how we interpret religious texts. It's why it's so important to engage in dialogue with others, to be open to different perspectives, and to always be willing to learn and grow.
This brings us back to that alternate history we were discussing earlier. If European Christians had approached indigenous cultures with a spirit of humility and respect, seeking to understand rather than to conquer, what might the world look like today?
It's a fascinating thought experiment. Instead of the violence and oppression that characterize so much of colonial history, imagine a world where different cultures coexisted peacefully, sharing their knowledge and traditions, and working together to create a more just and sustainable future.
I can picture vibrant cultural exchanges, a flourishing of artistic expression, and a deeper understanding of our shared humanity. Instead of trying to erase indigenous cultures, European Christians might have embraced their wisdom and learned from their deep connection to the land.
It's a tantalizing vision, and while we can't change the past, we can certainly learn from it. We can commit ourselves to building a future where respect, compassion, and understanding are the guiding principles of our interactions with each other and with the world around us.
So while the God of the Old Testament presents us with some challenging and even disturbing images, it's ultimately the message of love and compassion embodied by Jesus that should guide our actions as individuals and as societies. But this begs the final question. Is the God of the Old Testament, the God of wrath and judgment, truly the same God that Jesus called Father? It feels like we're wrestling with the ultimate theological mystery here.
It is a question that has challenged believers and skeptics alike for centuries.
I mean, how do we reconcile the God who seems to endure such brutal violence in the Old Testament with the God of love and forgiveness that Jesus embodies?
Yeah, it's a tension that runs throughout the Bible.
Yeah.
And has led to countless interpretations.
Abke's view is pretty clear-cut. He believes they're two completely different entities. He points out that Jesus never once calls God jealous or advocates for violence. In fact, he seems to constantly push back against those Old Testament ideas of retribution and punishment.
There's certainly evidence to support that view. Jesus' teachings are radically different from the often harsh and judgmental tone of the Old Testament. He emphasizes forgiveness, compassion, and love for one's enemies. It's a stark contrast.
Yeah, but if we accept that, doesn't it raise questions about the coherence of the Bible itself?
Well, some scholars and theologians argue that the Bible isn't meant to be read as a literal, word-for-word account of history or a rigid set of rules.
So how should we approach it then?
Many see it as a collection of stories, poems, and teachings that reflect the evolving relationship between humanity and the divine.
So the Old Testament might represent an earlier stage in that relationship, where God is seen as more of a tribal deity, concerned with justice and punishment.
Right, while the New Testament, through the life and teachings of Jesus, reveals a more universal and compassionate understanding of God.
But how do we explain the violence and cruelty in the Old Testament? I mean, those passages are hard to ignore.
Well, it's important to remember the historical context. The Old Testament was written in a time of tribal warfare and constant threats. It reflects the harsh realities of that era.
But even so, some of those stories are pretty disturbing. The idea of God commanding the slaughter of innocent people, including women and children, is hard to square with the idea of a loving God.
Yeah, it's a moral dilemma that has troubled believers for centuries. Some argue that those passages should be interpreted metaphorically, not literally.
But doesn't that feel a bit like we're trying to explain away the problem?
I think the challenge is to find an interpretation that honors the integrity of the text, while also aligning with our understanding of a just and loving God.
It seems like there's no easy answer here. Maybe it comes down to faith, to trusting that God is ultimately good, even if we don't always understand his ways.
Perhaps that's part of it, but I also think it requires us to engage with these texts critically, to wrestle with the difficult questions they raise, and to be open to the possibility that our understanding of God might evolve over time.
So what does this mean for Christian societies today? If the God of the Old Testament isn't the model for how we should live and govern ourselves, then what is?
I believe the answer lies in the teachings of Jesus. His message of love, forgiveness, and compassion offers a roadmap for building a more just and humane world.
But how do we translate those ideals into concrete actions? The world is full of conflict and injustice. It's easy to feel overwhelmed.
Because it starts with each of us, with how we treat others, how we engage in our communities, how we use our voices to advocate for those who are marginalized and oppressed.
So it's about living out those values of love and compassion in our everyday lives.
Exactly, and it's about working together to create structures and systems that reflect those values in our governments, our schools, our workplaces, and our families.
It sounds like a daunting task, but also a hopeful one. Maybe by embracing the radical message of Jesus, we can start to build a world that truly reflects the love and compassion that he embodied.
It's a journey that requires both faith and action, both personal transformation and societal change.
This deep dive has really challenged me to think differently about the nature of God, the meaning of the scriptures, and the role of faith in the world today.
And that's ultimately the goal, isn't it? To provoke thought, to spark conversation, and to inspire us to live more meaningful and purpose-driven lives.
Well, you've given us a lot to ponder today. If you stripped away all the doctrines and dogma, what is the essence of Jesus' teachings? Could it be a path of personal transformation and connection with the divine? That exists independent of any organized religion. That's something for you to reflect on out there.